I'm Josh Jackson, and this is OCF Crosspoint. Have you ever known anyone who's been passed over for promotion? Maybe it's your name that wasn't on the promotion list. My guest today talks about his experience being passed over for promotion and what that taught him about his identity. That's coming up next on episode 52.
You're listening to the OCF Crosspoint podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to sharing stories of military life at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
For Colonel Stu McRae, U.S. Army retired, when the 1997 promotion list was due to be officially released, a friend called him to say, "Stu, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I'm sorry, but your name isn't on the list." It was a lynchpin moment for Stu as he began examining what it meant to be a successful officer in the eyes of God, where he was placing his identity and his self-worth, and why he was wanting to be the best at his job in the first place. What were his motives? Let me tell you a little bit about Stu McRae. He was raised in Montana, where he was part of a multiracial family. In addition to Stu and his oldest sister, who were born to his parents, his mother and father adopted 11 other children, mostly Native American. Stu says this played a significant role in teaching him about the love and acceptance of God. In 1987, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in military intelligence and branch transferred to aviation in 1990. Stu went on to command the 224th Military Intelligence Battalion, which was a fixed-wing aviation battalion, and then was the Rear Detachment Commander for the 3rd Infantry Division in 2010. After graduating from the U.S. Army War College in 2011, Stu was selected to command the garrison of Fort Rucker, Alabama. He retired from the Army as a colonel in 2017 and now resides in Wyoming, where he works developing business opportunities for Kennan Products, as well as continuing to fly airplanes as a contractor in Afghanistan. Okay, let's jump into my conversation with Stu McRae. Stu, tell me about the time you were passed over for promotion.
So it was 1997. I had talked to people along the way at Human Resource Command, and nobody ever saw this coming. Some people who get passed over, their skeletons in their closet or something of that effect. I had nothing. And so it came as a complete surprise to me. I'd asked a friend who was the aide to the commanding general at the installation I was at to let me know when the results came out because, they typically get it a couple days ahead of time. And I think I wanted to start celebrating early. He called me up one night and said, "This is the hardest call I've ever had to make. Your name's not on the list." And kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. In retrospect, I was so glad that he talked to me because I was able to kind of process it in about the next day when I would then officially be notified by my command that I hadn't been selected. And I was able to kind of prepare myself mentally for what I might say to them. That was probably God's providence in that. But it was a hard pill to swallow when it happened. It was a real surprise to me.
Well, we're going to unpack that part of your story even more over the next half hour or so. But before we go any further, tell me more about yourself.
I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up in Montana, and my parents were really good, godly examples. My father he had served in the Army back in the 50s for about a couple years, but he was more into academia. He was a physics professor and then became a part of the administration of the college that I actually ended up going to growing up in Billings, Montana. Probably a whole story in and of itself, but they, in addition to my oldest sister and myself, they adopted 11 kids, mostly Native American kids. And so we had quite a rich experience growing up. But just the people around me helped to guide me. We use the term calling sometimes loosely, but I really did feel from an early age, I can remember back to 1972, wanting to go into the military. And everything I did throughout my growing up years was kind of focused towards going into the military. So that's kind of a, rough background that I had.
And you wrote about the topic of being passed over for promotion a number of years ago in an article that appears in OCF's Command magazine and also on our website. I'd like to start with a statement from that article that goes like this, and I quote, "A young officer works long hours characterized by daily rigid discipline, ever expecting that his branch of service will recognize his dedicated labors and reward them with promotion to the next rank. He lives and breathes his service culture, often putting the military before family and self." And then here's the main part of that passage I'd like to ask you about. You continue with this question. After all, isn't that what is expected of a successful officer? Stu, I'm going to hit you with several questions that come to mind. How do you answer that question? What should be expected of a successful officer? And if it's not to eat, sleep, and breathe your branch of service, then what is it?
A couple things I think are going to guide our discussion today, and two questions that immediately come to my mind, as especially these days as I reflect back on that time. And those questions, first of all, is where is your identity? And the second one is how close is your relationship with Christ? I'm assuming that our audience is going to be a Christian audience. That's the perspective that I'm coming from. Let me reframe that question a little bit because, the question, what is expected of a successful officer, doesn't quite make sense when you've been passed over. You don't feel yourself as successful. And so the term successful is probably what the reader and what I felt like when I was passed over. I thought that I was a successful officer, and now I'm being told that I wasn't. What I think I would rephrase the question would be, what is expected of a Christian officer?
Hmm.
Because I think that's really what is at stake here. Using those two questions, where is your identity and how close is your relationship with Christ? I would have to say that based on, the answer of your identity being in Christ and having a close relationship with God, it doesn't really matter, if you've been passed over or not. You've had a successful career, because your career is in the hands of the Lord. I could say that no matter the circumstances that you're facing, if you got yourself right with the Lord and your identity is appropriate, then you are successful.
Let's go back to your military career, continue the discussion of your military career. What did success or being a successful officer look like for you?
So let me phrase that in terms of before I was passed over, how I looked, the lens that I looked at the world, and after I was passed over, having come through that whole process, how I
Hmm.
looked at the world. I found, I guess to my shame, that before I was passed over, the Lord had to deal with a lot of things in my life, and He's been good to do that. But I found that I was relying on myself a lot. I felt that I had to compete with my peers. I felt that I had to stand out from the others, to look better than them. In the Army, really, the rating that makes the most important on a report card is the senior rater. So you have the person that you're working for, and the person that they work for is your senior rater. And in that case, I was focused more on what the senior rater thought of me and how I was doing with them than what my rater and person I was immediately working for was doing. And I was constantly strategizing and posturing for what were the opportunities. So it was very me trying to do everything and trying to really do what the Lord is, should take off our shoulders, really enjoying His presence and let Him take that load off of us. Now, fast forward to having gone through that process in hindsight, what the lessons I learned from this thing was I just started enjoying the moment. Whatever job I was in, I enjoyed what I was doing. I began to look at, I think it's in Colossians, that I was working as unto the Lord. And, everything I was doing was for an audience of one at this point. I began to work for my immediate supervisor and just trust him or her, whatever they were doing. I used to tell them, I said, whatever you tell me to do, your order is my order, unless it's illegal, immoral, or unethical. It's going to become my watchword. So they knew that they could count on me to take what their style was and adopt it as my policy. And then mostly, I just let God orchestrate the future. I put it in His hands, and it was much more liberating.
Stu, going back to the article for a moment, you made this comment, quote, "My whole identity was so wrapped up in the Army that it dictated how I felt about myself. If I did something well or was commended, I felt good about myself. If I was not commended or worse, was reprimanded, I was devastated." Now, on the surface, that might not sound like such a bad way of thinking. I mean, all of us enjoy being commended and we don't enjoy being reprimanded. But where do we draw the line as believers? And again, we want to do our best jobs or our jobs to the best of our abilities, but how can we know when that's become a bad thing, when we've crossed that line?
It goes back to that original question of where is your identity and how close is your relationship with Christ? When you're serving an audience of one, when your whole focus of life is focused towards hearing the words, well done, good and faithful servant, it changes your perspective. As the Christian officer, we should be even keeled. We shouldn't be tossed to and fro based on the circumstances around us. We should be that even keel. I think that's part of what the responsibility of a Christian believer is in the service is to be that example of, the Lord's got my back. And so I'm not going to worry about things. And so I think that's where we draw that line, where we find our identity. If our identity is in Christ, then we should be looking at things from his perspective. When adversity comes up, then we don't let it roil us because we know that it's going to work out. God says all things work out good for those who are called by his name. And so I think that, as we go through life, we're going to hit adversity. Everything's not going to be peachy. And I think God orchestrates it that way so that we develop resilience. As we do that, it should not be the thing that tosses us.
Well, how did you learn to put things in their proper perspectives? I mean, when did it finally click for Stu McRae that, hey, I need to put my identity in Christ?
I got to tell you that, God still, continues to identify things in my life and that I need to deal with as I progress through my walk. I won't say I'm not at the end zone doing the touchdown dance just yet. This was only one event of many that God dealt with me in my life. He's dealt with me in terms of pride,
Hmm.
and he's had to break that in my life, and he's dealt with me in the terms of trust and fear. And then so this was just another realm in my identity of him that I think that, as he rounds me out, he continues to do things. I want to go back to, if I may, to something that precipitated this whole process in my life, and that's back when I was in high school. I guess I would call myself I was a lukewarm Christian. I was just kind of coasting through life, and my mom, who was a just a really strong believer and just loved the Lord dearly, she's gone home to be with him as has my father. But one day she sat me down in her living room. She
Hmm.
didn't read me the riot act, but she just told me that she was concerned. She said she pulled out the book of Revelations of all things and said, "You remind me of the Laodiceans. They were neither hot nor cold, and God spit them out." And that got my attention. That day I prayed with her and I allowed God, and I do believe that it's important that we give God permission. I think God, we talk about the hound of heaven, but God is also a gentleman, I think. And
Hmm.
if we don't give him permission of areas of our life, we reserve that back for us, he's going to let us control it. And it's not going to be good for us because we're going to be running into all kinds of problems that we've caused ourselves because we're not giving him authority in our lives, in an area of our lives. And so I gave God authority to sweep out the various rooms of my life and to clean them up as he needed to. And he's been faithful to do that throughout my entire life. I've seen item after item where he's cleaned that out, but it comes with giving him permission, I think.
Well, I want to talk about something that I think is kind of an undercurrent to some of the things that you're talking about, and that's motives. When we think about the reason why we want to do the best we can do in our jobs or in some other area of our lives, what are some ways that we can test our motives?
Yeah, so in the article I wrote, I had 5 questions, and I said, the questions were: one, am I willing to surrender all areas of my life to God? And two is, if not, what specific areas of my life have I not surrendered to him? And I would add the question, why? Why not? And then three, from where or whom do I derive my identity? Four really is a follow on to three is who am I trying to please? And then five is, what is the order of my priorities with regards to God, family, and my career? With these things, I think those questions help to define your motives. When I was a young lieutenant, There was an Air Force captain, and I was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. There was a security officer, and he was an OCF member and just a real mentor of mine. And we used to have our OCF Bible studies at their house. He roomed with a couple other guys. And in his bathroom, in the mirror, he had tucked this little 3x5 card, and all it simply said was, "What is my motive?" And that spoke more to me as I went through life. I have reflected on that time and time again. Whenever I'm in a situation, I ask myself, what is my motive in this? And it's really served to help me to, reflect on why, am I trying to please man, or am I trying to please God? Are there areas that I have refused to let God have authority over? There's a good accountability in that.
Your article, which we've been referencing, closes with a verse from Psalm 37:4, which says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." And then you had this to write: "From the start of my career to now, God has steadily changed my desires to be more in line with his by eliminating unnecessary baggage. As we willingly submit to his authority, he's faithful to refine us and help us to find our complete fulfillment in him." Stu, practically speaking, what does this look like in the daily living of a believer? And what did it look like for you when you finally made that verse your own?
Well, I guess that's where that Colossians 3:23 comes in.
Hmm.
And that's, whatever you do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. If we have the perspective of one day we're going to have to give an account for our lives, with the person who has the authority over all life, we're going to want to have, something that reflects a proper perspective in the things that we've done. As I have gone through this process, I think delighting yourself in the Lord is associated with, just serving him. We had a pastor in Hawaii that reminded us, he said, God is a good God, but he's also in a good mood. And when he sees his children, it makes him smile. And I thought, what a fantastic way of looking at God, because a lot of times we think of God as judgmental. God will judge people. We will all be judged at one point. But when he sees us, he's going to see us through the lens of Jesus. And he's not going to see our flaws. He's going to see what he sees in Christ. If we see a loving God who wants the very best for us, I think it's a life-changing perspective. So as I go forward with this, as I practically doing this, I think that in everything you do, enjoy the moment, enjoy where you're at. Don't get wrapped up in the circumstances, but take the broader picture of where Christ is going to take you. One thing I do know about the nature of God is God does not want second best for any of us. He wants us to have best. Sometimes we think we know what best is, but oftentimes we don't. Best may not be continuing to serve in the military. It may be continuing, and it might be, something that happens miraculously. And, we just don't know that. What we do know as the character of God is that he wants what's best for us. And sometimes that means that we have to go through some hard experiences to get there. But in the end, we are going to be better off, and we're going to be more content and pleased with that as he refines us.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In fact, just this morning during our devotionals here in the OCF home office, we were kind of talking about what you just said there. And that was from the perspective really of prayer. And I forget somebody who it was, but somebody had asked the question, sometimes when it comes to our prayer life, we do think we know what's best for us. But can you imagine what your life would look like if God had taken your lead and had decided to answer all of your prayers? Where would you be right now? What would your life look like?
It'd be pretty screwed up, I think.
Might not be a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about where God has you now. Stu, you're retired from the military, but do you find that the struggle over your identity and these other things that we've been talking about is still there? What's different?
One of the things, the Army had since, I think, 1996 established this a formal process of Army values, and they had 7 Army values. Just recently, within the last month, they came out with an 8th value, which is humility.
Hmm.
And I wish I had have been the one that had recommended that, because that's one of the characteristics in any person that I've always valued the most, but I never really thought of it as one of the Army values. And I'm so glad that the Army has selected that, because I think that's what I find is the thing that I try to do now today is to embrace humility. And what does that look like? Right now, I just started a job where I'm still kind of participating with the military a little bit. I'm flying airplanes on a contract basis, and I find myself, I'm over in a combat zone periodically. And I was flying with a fellow. He was never been in the military, and he really paid me a nice compliment, I felt. He found out that I was a retired colonel, and he said, I would have never thought, you don't speak with a prideful tone or anything like this. And that really meant a lot to me, because that's really what I've been trying to achieve in my walk with the Lord, is to not be someone who is trying to have an identity. One of the things I guess that I've noticed in my perch, the Lord took me after I went through this whole process. He really opened my career. It was amazing to watch him unpack things, because there's not too many people who get passed over for promotion who then subsequently later on get to command. I commanded at the lieutenant colonel and at the colonel level. That's pretty unheard of for someone who's been non-select for promotion to major. In this case, I found those as opportunities to serve at a higher level and really embrace the concept of servant leadership. And I think that that's really where I've come into now. So my whole life now is focused more on less about me and more about the Lord, and how he can be glorified through my efforts. And if it means that I'm in a leadership position, it's about trying to be the best leader that the Lord would have me to be. And if it's in a follower position, then it's trying to be the best follower that the Lord would have me to be, and to support those that are in leadership, and not being wrapped up about if I'm working for someone. Right now, the leader of this contract that I'm working with is a former CW4, a warrant officer that used to work with me. And, so I know him. It's funny that I can easily work with him, and he can be my supervisor now. And it doesn't bother me that I, as a former colonel working for a warrant officer, because it's not about that anymore. It's about how I can continue to serve. The Lord says in his kingdom, the first will be last and the last will be first. And I want to be the first in his kingdom, so I want to be last here. I think that's where it really boils down to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we start to wrap up our conversation, do you have any resources you might recommend for listeners pertaining to this topic?
I thought about that, and you and I had talked previously about this. And so as I thought about resources, the thing the Lord's really been putting on my mind is, especially when someone goes through this devastating process, there's a real opportunity to find offense, and that's where Satan can really get a foothold in people's lives. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they've done me wrong because I worked so hard and I deserved this promotion. The reference I think I would refer to is John Bevere's The Bait of Satan, where he talks about even legitimate offense is not something that we can, in a godly way, take offense to. And so as we go down that road, I think that's a good resource to remind those who have gone through something like this, as they're trying to come to grips with it, remind themselves to turn it over to the Lord and let him fight the battles for them.
Well, final question for you. If listeners took away only one thing from our conversation today, what would you hope that it would be?
I would say actually three things.
Sure.
One is, if you go through and you come out the other end and everything seems to be rosy again, the decisions, the changes that you have put in place, because God has walked you through things, especially if you've made decisions on reprioritizing your walk with him, reprioritizing what your priorities are. We didn't even talk about this, but when, before I was passed over, I used to say that my priorities were God, then my family, then the Army. And they were just the opposite. They were really, the Army came first in everything. And so when I went through that process and reprioritized and said, okay, God, you're going to be first, and then my family, and then the Army, just know that you're going to be tested on that. In my case, the test came in Iraq in 2002. I had a battalion commander who wanted me to stay in Iraq longer than I needed to. And I had told my family that they were first priority. And I looked at the unit, and the unit was in good hands, and we weren't in dire straits. I certainly would have stayed longer if that was the case, but it wasn't. And it was just he felt insecure about it. And I recognized that. And so I told him that my family came first, and it got ugly. I thought that I was going to end up retiring as a major at that point because he basically told me that he wasn't going to do anything for me. But the Lord fights your battles. I felt in hindsight that that was a test that I passed after the fact. But people will get tested when we make changes, for the Lord. It's kind of like when you take a final exam. Second thing is just a reminder that, as we go through there, key takeaways that God does want to bless you. That He is good, He's in a good mood, and when He sees all of us, it makes Him smile, and He wants to bless us. And the last thing is just, our identity in Christ is so important. That is what will get us through any of these challenges that we go through, no matter what it is.
Yeah, that's so well said. Stu, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thanks for being a guest on the show and for sharing your story.
Thanks, Josh. I really appreciate the opportunity to encourage others who are going through hard times, and hopefully this is something that they find encouraging.
Okay, well, that's going to do it for another episode of OCF Crosspoint. And as always, if you have an idea for a guest, topic, or story you'd like for us to consider on a future episode of the show, just send an email to me at podcast@ocfusa.org. Thanks for taking time out of your day to spend it with us. We hope that you'll join us for the next OCF Crosspoint.
The views expressed by the hosts and guests of Crosspoint do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Officers Christian Fellowship of the United States of America, its governing council, staff, or of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. For more information about Officers Christian Fellowship, go to ocfusa.org.